Before we get to today's Bible study, let us look at the Hebrew word of the day, netzer, a tree shoot. When writing about the coming Messiah, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit." The rabbis have always believed that this new shoot refers to the long-awaited Messiah. Christians believe that this verse points to Jesus because he was from the family line of Jesse. But there's another symbol here that I think a lot of us often miss when we read this verse. See, Jesus grew up in the town of Nazareth, a name that comes from the Hebrew word meaning netzer, meaning shoot or branch. This is the word used by Isaiah. The word Nazareth basically means, if you'll excuse me, Shootsville. When the Bible refers to Jesus the Nazarene, the symbol is of Jesus the shoot, the one Isaiah predicted generations before Jesus was born. Jesus from Shootsville fulfills Isaiah's prophecy. I know many people who would argue that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, but in fact, he did many times in a very Jewish way that we often miss. This was a reading from 52 Hebrew Words Every Christian Should Know by Dave Adamson, published by Christian Art Gifts. You can purchase this on Amazon, or you can contact Christian Art Gifts at their website. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host, and here's my caffeine. In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Well, we start into chapter 2 today of Romans. Just to recap from chapter 1, in Romans chapter 1, Paul presents a carefully structured theological indictment rather than an emotional outburst. He doesn't pull his punches, but he does present his diagnosis that humanity's condition is rooted not in ignorance of God, but in the deliberate suppression of truth. Mankind is not the victim of ignorance, but of willful malfeasance. The chapter begins with creation as revelation. God's made himself plainly known through what he's made. His eternal power and divine nature are clearly perceived and understood. Nature itself says, of course there's a God. Look around you. Nature trumpets this truth. Humanity is therefore without excuse. The core problem is not insufficient evidence, but a refusal to honor or give thanks to God. This leads to the ultimate conclusion. Man wants to control the narrative about everything. Man wants to reinvent history, nature, sexuality, genders, everything. Man wants to recreate the world around him, and to make it into a world which God does not appear. God's response to this rebellion is surprising. It says that God gave them over. In other words, he doesn't force them to do anything they don't want to do. God's judgment takes the form of releasing humanity to pursue the desires it has already chosen. It's like he opens the door to the next room and tells them, go there if that's what you want. This giving over exposes the true orientation of the human heart and allows sin to run its natural course. In other words, God says, if this is what you want, then this is what you'll get. Be careful what you wish for. Paul identifies this phrase, the desires of their hearts, as the driving force behind this action. What a person desires fuels their actions. Now, the danger here is that if you pursue what you think you want long enough, it will become a death sentence. Do you not want God in your life? Eventually, you reach a point where you become so embroiled in your chosen lifestyle working against God that you are cemented in place with your eternity sealed. I don't know where that line is. I don't know where that line of demarcation exists. But all you have to do is look at the story of the Pharaoh and Moses to see that you can reach a point of having defied God for so long that he acquiesces to your will and makes your separation from him permanent. After all, isn't that what you wanted? Everything Paul lists in Romans 1 is a result of what humanity desires. For example, sexual impurity in Romans 1 is presented not merely as behavior, but as the outward expression of disordered desire. The violation of the one flesh design established at creation demonstrates mankind's proclivity to go in a direction not sanctioned by God, as suppressed truth gives way to unchecked desire. The mind itself becomes darkened. Although humanity claims wisdom, it becomes foolish, not intellectually, but morally and spiritually. This progression culminates in what Paul describes as a depraved mind, evidenced by a comprehensive list of sins that fracture both personal character and communal life. The list is not in any particular order, yet it does reveal the breadth and depth of human brokenness once God is excluded. It's the logical conclusion of humanity being in charge and God being totally out of the picture. Romans 1 is not intended to single out particular groups, but to expose the universal consequences of rejecting God's self-revelation. With or without the law, there is enough information available through God's creation to inform you about him. The chapter intentionally unsettles the reader, preparing the ground for Romans 2, where moral superiority is dismantled, and all humanity is shown to stand equally accountable, Jew and Gentile. The chapter, therefore, functions as both warning and preparation, revealing the fact that humanity is in the business of suppressing the truth about God and the consequences of disordered desire. So, let's get to chapter 2, verse 1. We read, "You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." As Romans turns from chapter 1 to chapter 2, Paul makes it clear that he's addressing two audiences, Jews and Gentiles. Having indicted Gentiles for sinfully rejecting God's revelation through nature, Paul shows that Jews have also turned from the even clearer revelation that God gave them. Let's look at the word excuse as used in that phrase, you therefore have no excuse. In Romans 2:1, the word translated excuse is a Greek anapologetos. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. Please forgive me. But the word is built from two words, without and apologia, a defense. It literally means without a defense, unable to mount a legal argument, or having nothing to say in one's own defense. This is courtroom language. Paul is not speaking casually or emotionally. He's prosecuting a case. Paul used the same word at the end of Romans 1 to describe the Gentile world. Creation itself leaves humanity, ana apologetos, before God. Now, in Romans 2:1, Paul deliberately turns that same verdict back on the moral or religious critic, especially the Jews, who hear chapter 1 and agree with it. It's like he's saying the Gentiles have no legal standing to defend themselves. Neither do you. The rhetorical punch is sharp. You judge them, and in doing so, you condemn yourself. You are just as anapologetos as they are. This word doesn't suggest that a person tried to defend himself and failed because their argument was weak or unconvincing. It means something far stronger and more final. It means there's no legitimate defense to offer. You are silent in court. You have nothing that you can say. The defendant's not overruled. He's disqualified from speaking. He has no standing in the court, no legal footing from which to argue his case. Paul's use of anapologetos signals that every familiar refuge is being methodically dismantled. Ethnic privilege, no shelter. Descent from Abraham, covenant history, or national identity does not override personal accountability before an impartial judge. Possession of the law provides absolutely no immunity. Having God's revealed will does not excuse disobedience to it. It intensifies your responsibility. Moral discernment. Well, that's not a defense, but evidence. The ability to recognize sin in others proves awareness of the standard that you have failed to keep. Religious confidence collapses under scrutiny. External markers of faith, ritual, or reputation cannot compensate for a life that contradicts professed truth. Paul is relentless in making this point. None of these functions as a defense when conduct contradicts knowledge. Each one, when relied upon, actually strengthens the case for judgment rather than weakening it. What was assumed to be a protection becomes incriminating evidence. By stripping these away, Paul leaves the hearer with no appeal in God's court. Only the stark reality of standing exposed before God. The courtroom is silent, not because the argument has been lost. There's nothing to say. Here's a modern day example. Imagine this scenario. You're the president of a homeowners association, and you decided to take a fellow member to court for violating HOA bylaws. His offenses are clear, at least on paper. His house is painted blue, a color expressly forbidden. He has 2 trees in his front yard when only one is permitted. And most egregious of all, he owns a dog that runs freely in his backyard, even though the bylaws insist that all dogs must remain indoors. Armed with documentation, bylaws highlighted and tabbed, you march into court ready to see justice served. When your name is called, you present your case confidently. Every accusation is accurate. Every rule cited is correct. You sit down afterwards, satisfied, even a bit smug. The violations are undeniable. Then the judge speaks. He says, "You seem to have an impeccable grasp of the HOA bylaws." You say, "Well, thank you. I take pride in staying informed." The judge nods and continues. "How many trees are in your front yard?" The president goes, "Well, 3. There's a pause. "And your house? This particular shade of green, is that color on the approved HOA list?" You, bristling, say, "No. But as HOA president, I have certain privileges." Another pause. And you own a dog, a Pyrenees, I believe. You regularly allow it into your backyard, correct?" You say, "Yeah, but that breed requires extensive exercise. Keeping it indoors would be unreasonable. Besides," gesturing toward the defendant, "his miniature poodle doesn't need the same accommodations." At this point, the judge leans forward, peering over the rim of his glasses. The fact that you know the HOA rules so thoroughly, and yet are openly violating the very same rules you accuse the man of breaking, tells me you have no business in this courtroom. You have no standing, you have no case. You are more culpable than the defendant. He might plausibly claim ignorance of certain bylaws. You cannot. You know them. You disregard them anyway. The next time you come before this court, you'd better have a better explanation for your behavior than you've offered today. Case dismissed. And with that, the gavel falls. That's precisely the point that Paul is making in this chapter. Yes, the Gentile nations are ungodly. Yes, their practices are ungodly. They are violating God's law in every way imaginable. But in the midst of the case you are building against them, you forget that your conduct convicts you of the same thing. You see, to know the good is to be accountable to it. Moral knowledge implies responsibility. Moral insight does not grant immunity, it increases liability. The person who sees clearly is not safer in the courtroom, he is more exposed. Now, this is a reversal of religious instinct. Many assume that awareness of God's will places them closer to justification. Paul argues the opposite. Knowledge raises the bar. The more clearly you see, the less excuse you have for failing to live accordingly. Well, let's read this first verse of chapter 2 again. "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself because you pass judgment, because you who pass judgment do the same things. The one who judges does the very things he condemns. Responsibility exposes hypocrisy." Paul will clarify even more in chapter 3, but the truth of the matter is this: sin cannot be avoided. We're sinners. We sin. The most religious among us sin. doesn't change things if nobody else catches you at it. The sin in your heart and actions accuses and convicts. In God's court, Paul is claiming moral inconsistency, or in other words, hypocrisy. The standard used to condemn others rebounds onto the one who pronounces it. Hypocrisy in Paul's argument is not merely pretending to be righteous. It's failing to live up to the truth one proclaims to uphold, and the act of judgment publicly establishes that truth. I know it seems I'm repeating myself over and over and over on this topic, but it bears repeating. The very minute you judge another as the Jews were wont to judge the Gentiles, you convict yourself. Pretend that you're pointing your index finger at something or someone. An old Sunday school teacher once said that when you point at someone else to accuse them, you have 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. That's why Paul says that the one who judges condemns himself. No external witness is needed. In other words, the very act of judging proves the case against you. The person who thought he was sitting in the jury box suddenly finds himself on the witness stand and then in the defendant's chair. His own words are entered into evidence against him. Paul's aim is not humiliation, but preparation. Before grace can be heard as good news, every false confidence must be dismantled. Romans 2 ensures that no one, especially the morally or religious confident, can escape the verdict by appealing to insight, heritage, or discernment. The courtroom must fall silent before mercy can speak. You therefore have no excuse who pass judgment on someone else. For whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now, again, this word that's translated have no excuse, I love it. By repeating apologetos in Romans 1 and 2, Paul signals that chapters 1 and 2 are really not 2 discussions. A single discussion applied to 2 audiences. The pagan, Gentile, is without excuse because he rejected revelation. The moralist, the Jew, is without excuse because he violated the truth he claimed to uphold. Neither group has anything to say. The result is silence before the judge, exactly where Paul wants every listener before he introduces grace. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. You see in Romans 2:1, that verse we just read, remember that the target of his argument is a Jewish moralist, one who hears the indictment of Gentile sin in chapter 1 and responds with agreement, perhaps even satisfaction. Paul speaks to this reader from the inside, not as an outsider. He's a Pharisee and a rabbi, one who's trained to teach in the synagogue, so he addresses the Jew as one who knows the law, values righteousness, and assumes moral distance from the pagan world. Paul is a Jew. He's one of them. This confrontation carries particular weight because Paul himself once stood in that very position. As a Pharisee, zealous and violently religious, he understood the temptation to equate covenant identity with moral immunity. He might as well be talking to himself. Romans 2:1 can be read as Paul reasoning with someone like himself before Christ, someone convinced that Gentile corruption proved Jewish superiority. In this sense, Paul's not merely arguing against another group. He's holding himself up as someone who truly knows both sides of the coming argument. He exposes the danger of judging Gentiles wholesale while overlooking the same sins within one's own heart. The bigotry talked about here is not defined by hatred alone, but by group-based judgment, condemning others because they belong to the wrong people. It might as well be an older Paul talking to the younger, angry Saul, full of religious fury, arrogance, and bigotry. I've often reflected on earlier versions of myself and the choices I made along the way. From time to time, an unexpected memory will surface, an uninvited reminder of a moment when I embarrassed myself or brought shame to my family or grieved God. Those memories are painful, and if I'm honest, I would rather they stay buried, yet they carry a strange and sobering value. They give me firsthand experience, lived examples I can draw from when warning someone else what not to do, because I have stood on both sides of certain decisions. I can see the issue with clarity that only hindsight and repentance can bring. As a result, were you to be around me throughout the day, you'd probably hear me repeat the text from the Kyrie of the Ordinary of the Catholic Mass several times. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Every time one of these memories pops up, I respond with that. I can easily imagine Paul holding himself up as embodying both sides of the arguments he's presenting here in this letter to the Roman Church. He is not attacking from a distance. He is reasoning from experience. Few men were more qualified than Paul to address a Jewish moralist who assumed superiority over Gentiles simply because of the covenant identity and knowledge of the Torah, because that was Paul. He knew the law. He defended it fiercely, believed himself righteous because of it. That was his identity, his confidence, his resume before that fateful trek to Damascus and his encounter with the risen Christ. Paul's confrontation with Jesus did not merely change his theology. It shattered his self-perception. The man who once judged others from a position of moral certainty now understood the depth of grace precisely because he had once been blind to it. When Paul speaks to the Jew who judges the Gentile, he's not speaking about someone else. He's speaking as someone who once stood in the same place. That is what gives his words such force. He is not condemning from above. He's testifying from within. By addressing the Jewish reader in this way, Paul collapses the false divide between us and them. Truthfully, it is all us. It's also reasonable to wonder whether Paul was already aware of the potential Jew-Gentile tensions within the Roman Church as he was writing this letter. Maybe that's why he spoke this way in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Rome was not an abstract audience to him. Even though he had not yet visited, he was deeply connected to a network of believers who moved between cities. It's entirely plausible that Aquila and Priscilla, who Paul met in Corinth and later worked with in Ephesus, helped bring him up to speed in the realities of Rome. Having been expelled from the city themselves under Claudius's decree, they would have had first-hand knowledge of both the social pressures and the eternal dynamics facing the church there. I don't find it implausible at all that Aquila and Priscilla were concerned about the Jewish-Gentile relationship in Rome, particularly in light of the Jewish exile. With Jewish believers forcibly removed, Gentile Christians would assume greater leadership and influence within the church in Rome. That shift, while perhaps necessary, also carried the risk of reshaping the church's identity in ways that might alienate returning Jewish believers once the decree was lifted. It would not be surprising to me to find Aquila and Priscilla wondering what kind of church would be waiting for them when they were finally allowed to return, and whether unity could survive that kind of disruption. Paul exposes the danger of assuming that covenant identity, possession of the law, or moral discernment exempts one from God's judgment. His strategy is as pastoral as it is theological. By first gaining assent and then overturning it, Paul dismantles any sense of moral distance between Jew and Gentile. Both stand equally in need of God's grace. Neither can claim superiority before the righteous judgment of God. Remember, you therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. Paul is speaking to a people who are so taken up with the faults of others that they often don't consider their own failures. The judgment Paul condemns is not discernment, but group-based righteousness. The Jews are not condemning Gentile behavior on the merits of that behavior. No, they're actually judging them from the point of being a Jew, which makes them, in their estimation, superior to pagan Gentiles. That is the foundation of racism and bigotry. The Jew condemns the Gentile because they're Gentiles, not because what they do is wrong. The Gentiles' guilt is based solely on their being Gentiles. Some Jews assume their moral distance from the Gentiles is created by circumcision, Torah, and heritage. It's easy, strangely comforting, to point out the faults and failings of others so long as we quietly exclude ourselves from the indictment. Moral comparison gives the illusion of righteousness. As long as someone else appears worse, we feel justified, secure, even validated. In Romans 2, 1 and 2, Paul addresses Jewish believers who, having heard his sweeping indictment of Gentiles' sin in chapter 1, naturally assume a position of moral superiority. Their confidence rests on two pillars: knowledge of the law, covenant identity. Surely they're not like these people. Paul dismantles that assumption with sobering precision. He warns that passing judgment on others while practicing the same sins yourself is not an act of righteousness, but an act of self-condemnation. To judge is not just to recognize a sinner, but it's also the recognition of the standard used to judge. Possession of the law does not excuse hypocrisy, it exposes it. Far from shielding the Jewish believer from judgment, moral discernment actually heightens accountability. Although Paul spoke these words to Jews nearly 2,000 years ago, they cut just as sharply today. The categories may have changed, but the posture hasn't. How often do we imagine ourselves standing on the high moral ground when evaluating other denominations, other ethnic groups, unbelievers, political camps, social circles? We may not appeal to Torah observance or covenant markers, but we appeal to correct doctrine, moral awareness, cultural alignment, personal discipline. The mechanism's the same. I'm not like them, therefore I occupy the high moral ground. Paul confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. God's judgment is impartial. He doesn't grade on a curve, nor is he impressed by religious vocabulary, theological precision, or outward conformity. No one escapes the mirror of truth. The standard we apply to others is a standard by which we ourselves will be measured. Paul's warning forces the reader to turn the gaze inward, where excuses are far harder to attain. The real challenge, then, is not learning how to judge others, but more accurately, learning how to examine our own hearts honestly. Paul insists that we look inward and upward toward the God who sees without favoritism and judges with perfect justice. In the end, Paul offers no soft landing here. He doesn't qualify his words or dilute their force. He simply tells Jewish believers plainly and unmistakably, you are without excuse. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Whew. All right. That's a lot to digest. But there's a lot of good stuff there. That is truth. So before I get to closing out, I just want to remind you, go to www.coffeebiblepage.com and you will find links to all my podcasts that I've done since I've started doing podcasts. I think there's over 400 of them now. And you could go to Amazon.com and search for Paige Garwood, and you will find a series titled Essays in, and there's a list of all the Bible study books that I have written so far. And you can find the Bible study book for this chapter 2 there, which you can use as we continue through chapter 2. It's a good place to stop. God is good all the time. This is Paige. Here's my coffee. Folks, I'm out of here. Have a glorious day. Bye-bye. Go to Amazon.com and do a search for my name, Paige Garwood, and you will find my Essays in Romans series. Each book is dedicated to a chapter of Romans and will contain the script of each podcast, plus thought-provoking questions at the end to help you with your studies. Again, Essays in Romans in Amazon. Search for Paige Garwood. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige with your host, Paige C. Garwood, thinking with his mouth open since Noah was tarring the ark.